Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of TRUUU Podcast. I'm your host Alex.
And I'm Drea.
And today we're going to be talking about a very special show for me and Drea. Special in the sense of we both like the spooky things. And the new season's about to come out soon. We're going to be talking about The Haunting, but this one of Hill House.
Yes, so the first season of what is to come, The Haunting at Bly Manor.
Right. Lately we've been rewatching in the past couple of weeks to gear up and get ready for the new season that's coming out in a couple of weeks. We're really excited. So we're going to do quick recaps of the episodes and give our take on how we feel.
Yes, and before we start real fast, I just want to say that I feel like when we started watching the show, it was kind of like by chance, because I wasn't necessarily like trying to watch a scary show. And I think you and I, it was when we were working at the shop still.
Right.
And you came over one time, and I think I was just like, oh, have you heard of this show? It's supposed to be creepy. And you're just like, put it on.
Yeah, because at that point, actually, my parents had started watching it.
Oh, had they?
Yeah, but they were moving really slowly, so we ended up lapping them really fast.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh.
I'm fairly certain.
Okay, so, so like Alex said, we're just going to do quick recaps, and then we'll talk about our feelings on each episode. So obviously, if you haven't watched the show and you want to, probably don't listen. If you don't care so much and you just want to listen to the whole first season so you can start the second season ago, perfect. Okay, so episode 1. This episode is entitled Steven Sees a Ghost. And the way that the first couple episodes and a couple of the later ones go is that each episode kind of revolves around a character. So this one obviously revolves around Steve, who is the eldest son. And the opening to this episode basically introduces the family. It's a family of 7. The dad, Hugh, the wife, Olivia, Stephen as the oldest son, Shirley, the second oldest, Theo, Luke, and Nell. And Luke and Nell, they're twins. And the youngest, obviously.
They're the Crane family.
The Crane family. And so they have just purchased this house called Hill House, which I feel like if you purchase a house that has a name, it's probably not great. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I mean, at the same time, their profession is like they're house flippers.
That's true. But still, like, you know, if I purchase a house and it's just like, oh, Bly Manor, like, I'm like, nah, like, you know, somebody was killed in this house, I'm not down. But anyway, so they purchase Hill House, and like Alex said, they are, like, property flippers. So their intent is to live here for the summer, in which time they are going to renovate the house and then flip it for a profit, which they will use the proceeds to purchase their forever home. Because prior to this, I guess they've been constantly like kind of moving around, doing the whole flipping job. So as the story opens, we kind of see that Stephen is now a world-renowned, not world-renowned, but he's a pretty popular author, and he's pursuing his latest book, and it appears that they are all horror-themed. So as we see that Stephen is kind of going down this avenue, we're also seeing that all the different kids that we saw in the opening went their own separate ways. And there's a lot of hints at traumatic events that happened while they were at Hill House that one summer that they moved in. So we're introduced to a lot of spooks. For example, the youngest daughter, Nell, we're introduced to the Bent Neck Lady, which is a recurring demon, quote unquote, throughout the season. And basically what happens to Nell is that when she's sleeping, she awakes to see this figure of this woman with a broken neck just staring at her, or in another scene is like floating, levitating above her, just like staring her dead in the eye. Really unsettling, but we're starting to be introduced to the idea that, okay, there's something supernatural going on in this house, or something supernatural that's plaguing this family. So, like I said, Stephen, he is pursuing his next book, so he's just kind of interviewing this woman who supposedly has a haunted story, whatever, and he's spending the day in her house, la la la. And while he's doing this, he receives a phone call from the youngest sister, Nell. He obviously ignores it. It cuts to Shirley, who is the second oldest, and she currently works in a funeral home, which we'll get into that in the second episode, and she too ignores the call. So it brings us to Nell, who is kind of in this dank, like, motel room, poorly lit, like, really just bad vibes. And she just looks like she's having, like, a breakdown. And so finally she calls her dad, Hugh, and he answers, and she basically is like, like, dad, the bent neck lady, is back. And this, obviously, at this point, she's an adult. And so he, like, immediately from her saying that, like, gets panicked. And he's just like, okay, like, you go to your brother's house. You stay there, la, la, la. Like, I'm coming. And then so at this point, and she says, yeah, I will. Like, I'm safe. I'm at home. And at this point, we realize she's in front of Hill House in the woods at night. And as she's looking at the house, the lights inside the house turn on. And mind you, this house is vacant. So the lights turn on and beckon her inside. And she gets out of the car and goes inside. No shocker, she dies. And so this news is then delivered to the siblings. But the way that it happens is kind of just interesting. So, for example, with Stephen, he is sleeping at that house. I'm telling you that he's like doing the research on the book 4. He awakes in the middle of the night gasping. You see Shirley, you see Theo, you see them all just kind of like waking up in the middle of the night, like being like, whoa, what's going on? And Luke, Nell's twin, also does this.
So an important thing to note at this point, though, is that half of the siblings are on the West Coast, half are on the East Coast.
Correct.
So Luke and Steven and supposed to be Nell are all supposed to be on the West Coast, and then the rest of them are on the East Coast. So you see the clock before they all wake up, and it's, I think, 3 a.m. on the East Coast, midnight on the West Coast.
Yes.
And they all wake up at the same time to kind of show that it's all simultaneous, like as she dies.
Correct.
They all wake up.
Like they all have this weird feeling, I guess. So blah, 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 fast forward, Stephen goes home, and as he's entering his apartment, he sees a figure like on the stairs above him, and he looks up and he sees that it's Luke, who is supposed to be in rehab. And he's standing there holding an iPad and a camera, presumably that he had stolen from Stephen's apartment. So Stephen, as a good brother, I guess, is just like really calm about it, and he's just like, just give me my iPad, you can sell the camera, and here's $200, like just, whatever, just go wild. He gives that to him. He goes up to his apartment, and he sees Nell in there, and so he's just like pissed, because he's just like, Nell, what the heck, like you're just gonna stand there and let Luke like rob me, and and at this point he doesn't know that she has passed away, so he's like full on like just kind of like ripping into her, having this whole conversation with her. And then he gets a phone call from his dad, which he answers, and he tells him, your sister is dead. Mm-hmm. So he turns around, and at this point, mind you, so he's at one corner of the room, she's at the other corner. He's on the phone, we're looking at him, and then he turns around, and all of a sudden she's right in front of him, and then she just starts turning into this, like, corpsey, like, creepy looking thing, and he, like, falls back.
And she starts
screaming. And he falls back, and, like, I guess that's, like, like, he saw a ghost, la, 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 like, Nell's dead. And that's basically how the first episode ends. So, what thoughts immediately come to your head from the first episode?
So, I think one important thing to note about Steven that's kind of revealed in this episode is that as an author, he kind of seems to be a one-hit wonder. Like, everyone is so obsessed about the book that he wrote about their experience at Hill House, which is, like, in contention because, like, you're kind of seeing through flashbacks and through, like, the story in the first episode that Steven doesn't believe in ghosts at all.
Right.
Like,
which, with the title of the episode also, like, goes to play off of that idea. Like, Steven sees a ghost. Like, now as an adult, after he's done all these things, he sees his first ghost.
Yeah, so...
quote, unquote.
You kind of see the family here really kind of being jerks to each other and not, like, wanting to interact.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a good, I think, setup to what continues to happen, during the thing. Because I feel like this, as far as horror stuff goes, is kind of a slow burn.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't really start getting spooky until, like, the 6th episode.
Totally. And, like I said, I feel like the first couple episodes, like, are setting the scene to explain each character, which I think is important because, like, being that there's 7 characters, like, you have to, like, get a backstory for them.
Right.
So, obviously, the first couple episodes are going to be a little bit more, like, informative than, like, ooh, interesting kind of deal. So, this episode is good for what it is. There's definitely way better episodes. So, let's move on to the second one.
So, second one is called Open Casket, and this is an episode that's more or less focused on Shirley.
Who's the second oldest?
Yeah, the second oldest, the oldest daughter. And it opens with her working at her funeral home. And when we say funeral home, it's literally her house that also happens to be a funeral home.
which
You know,
is so problematic to begin with.
it really is. You need some separation, I feel like, between work and home, and she has, like, none.
Especially with that particular line of work, you know?
Yeah. So, this kind of a little bit shows how she gets into her profession, because you figure out that her mom died young. And it seems to be around the time that they lived in that house, because they're all, like, when they flash back to the mom's funeral, they're all the same age as they have been in the first episode when they're doing flashbacks. Because I'm not sure if we said that before. It's a lot of flashbacks and a lot of present-day stuff.
Mm-hmm, current.
And she's having a really hard time at the funeral because she doesn't want to see her mom in the open casket.
Which goes to, like, suggest that something horrific has happened to her mom's body that makes her look not the way she should. You know, like, if someone dies of natural causes, like, they're not going to look scary.
Right. And I think kids just in general probably just don't feel like seeing dead bodies. I think that's
true.
something that will just scare them.
Mm-hmm.
So the overly involved mortician, because I feel like it's more overly involved than it should be, he, like, comes up to Hugh and to Shirley and just like, hey, like, what's going on? And he was like, oh, you know, she's just scared. And then the mortician's just like, oh, let me go with you. So he holds Shirley's hand and goes up to the open casket and is like, see, you know, she's fine. And then Shirley has this really weird, like, eureka moment where she's just like, oh my goodness, she's exactly the same as she looked before. And she, like, trips out over it, which I feel like, you know, is a interesting thing, but whatever, we'll talk about it later. Which kind of leads to, like, other traumas with death that Shirley has had. Because in this episode, Shirley also has found a box of kittens in a shed.
When she was a kid.
Right, yeah, when she was kids, I'm sorry. Which, first of all, she finds in a wasp's nest that was, like, under a desk in a shed, and the wasp's nest had been built around a mask.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if, you know, you guys can picture that, but it looks like there's some ghostly thing under this table, and then she fetches her dad, and then the kind of like the land keeper, I guess, the family that looks over the house, yeah, Mr. Dudley, brings them over and just like, hey, there's this really creepy thing in the shed, and then, like, they look in and, oh, just a mask, whatever, and they find these kittens, which Hugh really doesn't want her to keep, but she's really insistent upon for whatever reason. So she, you know, has these kittens. They end up dying, one by one, kind of. And it's just a really, like, it turns into this horrible thing where they bury the last kitten, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Hugh and Liv, the mom, are trying to teach her about, you know, death and whatever, and about funerals, and, like, oh, you should say something nice for this kitten or whatever. And Shirley, like, gives a little eulogy, and then the kitten's mouth starts moving, and she's tripping out because she's like, oh my goodness, the cat's still alive. And then Hugh and Liv are just like, oh no, it's definitely not alive. And then a bug comes out of the kitten's mouth and she starts screaming, and that's fun.
Yes.
Great
I mean,
stuff.
traumatizing all around.
And another thing that kind of goes on in this episode is that she's a little bit fixated on opening this red door that's in the house, which is on top of in the library, on top of a spiral staircase. There's one door that's leading into a room that they don't know about. The door is locked. She goes to Mr. Dudley to try to see, you know, if there's any way to open it. He has a skeleton key, which, if you don't know what a skeleton key is, it's a key that is supposed to open any door in a, you know, specific area. So in this house, this should open any door. She tries to open it, has a little hissy fit about it because she can't, and Nell's with her as well. And as they walk away, there is a shadow that moves under the door, so you kind of see that that's going to be something that's bookmarked for later. And it's also the first episode where Liv starts having migraines, which she calls color storms, which I think is something that you could only experience, like, if you've had a migraine before. Like, she starts, I guess, seeing some color.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also, you know, flashing back to the present where, you know, Nell's dead, and because she already is a mortician, she wants to take care of her sister's body. She wants to, you know, put it all back together again. And when she finally goes down to, like, her working area to take care of her sister's body, she ends up hallucinating, seeing a bug crawling out of Nell's mouth.
Just like the kittens.
Just like the kittens. And then, like, she looks up at the other table, and her dead mother is there, like, rising up, and she trips out again.
Which is such a pleasant thought, you know, to see.
So, yeah, it's just kind of showing how tightly wound I think Shirley is in that episode.
Yeah, and this is something that me and Alex, like, vehemently, like, agree on. Shirley's the worst.
For sure.
She is definitely the most antagonizing character in this whole series. So it's, like, difficult to sympathize almost, because it's just like, you're doing it to yourself, Shirley. Like, why are you insisting on taking care of your dead sister's body? Like, that can't be healthy for your mental state.
And also, she's, like, the most antagonistic towards her siblings.
Yeah.
Just, like, in general, especially towards Steve.
Yeah, definitely. Like, she acts like a mom.
Well, yeah, and she has feelings about him writing a book about their childhood.
The house, right.
Especially since... And profiting off of it.
Right.
Because she, as she likes to say, it's blood money.
Yes, blood money.
And also blames Steve for Nell's death. Kind of in a roundabout way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not a fun episode. I think out of all the episodes to skip, this would be the one.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, any other last thoughts on that?
No, you can basically sum it up, and Shirley's the worst.
Shirley's the worst. Okay, so episode 3. This one is called Touch, and this whole episode is basically about Theo, who is the middle child. This episode opens with Theo at work, and we see that she is a psychologist, or psychiatrist or something, some sort of therapist. And it opens up with her interviewing a little girl who's saying that she's having some problems with a Mr. Smiley, who is a figure, I guess, that she has manifested that lives in her basement. And so Theo is just kind of like, what's the word? Really bothered, I guess, by this, and it sticks with her throughout the episode, this idea of a Mr. Smiley. And he also introduced the idea that she has some sort of, like, sensitivity, because she touches this little girl's hand and then gets some kind of, like, I don't know, answer out of it. And so that's kind of, like, delved into a little bit more when we start going back to the, like, flashbacks. And we see that when she was in Hill House, she would, like, touch things, or she was always wearing sweaters, because she had this, like, sensitivity to the energies that was in the house. And this is, like, exhibited through, like, different times. So, for example, Hugh is throwing away a bunch of things, and he gives her this box, and he's like, oh, trash this. And she touches it, and she's like, no. Like, this is fancy. We need to keep this. And so he opens the box, and it's, like, this really old wine. And he's just like, whoa, how did you know? And she's like, I don't know. And so, like, a bunch of different things happen in her childhood that kind of just, like, really delves into this whole idea that she has, like, this weird touch sensitivity to, like, energies. And apparently it also, like, kind of runs in the family, because when she's, like, talking to her mom about this, her mom tells her how she, you know, with her color storms, quote unquote, like, she has these different, like, visions, and, like, this is this. And so we kind of see that, like, the whole family has these different ways of perceiving energies.
Right, and, like, this is something you kind of see earlier in the episode when Liv is talking to the housekeeper, Mrs. Dudley, about this one part in the library is cold.
Yeah.
And, like, anyone who knows about ghost stuff, cold spots is kind of a ghost thing.
Right.
And Theo happens to pass by, and Liv's just like, hey, are you cold in here? And Theo's just like, it's cold in this entire house.
Yeah.
So, like, Liv is kind of sensitive, whereas Theo is very sensitive.
Very sensitive, correct. Yeah, and then it goes on to show how Theo becomes kind of like a... What do I want to say here? She kind of legitimizes the experiences that her siblings are having in the house. So, for example, there's a scene where Liv is, like, yelling at Nell because she wrote her name, supposedly. She wrote her name on the wall. And when Theo goes in and she, like, touches Nell's, or she touches the wall or something, she's just like, no, like, Nell didn't do this, like, la, 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 and then Liv gets all pissed, whatever. And then there's another part where Luke is trying to go down on, or not down, but trying to, like, take a ride in the dumbwaiter, which is basically, like, a, what do we even, like, a, kind of like a laundry chute?
So if you could kind of, like, imagine a mini service elevator, like, in old houses or in even sometimes, like, older hotels, like, you think about, so they were in the kitchen when they did this, so, like, you think, okay, the help is going to put a meal in this dumbwaiter and put it up to a certain floor, and I could just get it out of there.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's to transport small things between floors, really.
Yeah. So like a mini elevator. So Luke is trying to take a ride in it, and the whole episode, Mrs. Dudley is just like, get away from that, it's dangerous, la la la. And then finally he convinces Theo, because they're kids, you know, like they're just like, oh, fun, whatever. So she puts him in the dumbwaiter and like, you know, has it go up, but instead of going up, it ends up going down. And so he goes into this basement that they didn't know existed, and while he's in this basement, he sees this figure start crawling towards him, and he's just screaming, and Theo's freaking out, and then the parents come in. Long story short, they get him back up, and he has his like shirt ripped and all this stuff. And so he's talking to Theo later, and he's just like, Mom and Dad don't believe me, like they don't believe me about the basement, they don't believe me about anything, whatever. And she like touches his shirt or whatever, she touches his hand, she's like, I believe you. And so from that, she ends up discovering this like bootleg basement that the house had that wasn't included in any of the blueprints. So basically, like, you know, the parents are just like, what the heck, like, how did you know this, la la la. Anyway, so it goes back to present day. And so now we know that she's very sensitive to feeling energies. And so when she touched that girl who was telling her about Mr. Smiley, she felt like something was wrong. So she ends up taking a little trip to her house and doing kind of like a house visit. And she goes into the basement and she's feeling around, seeing if she can get any feel for like any spots in the room. And she stops when she comes to the couch. And long story short, she realizes that the little girl is being molested by her foster father. And really horrific. So she calls the cops, they take him away, and it's just kind of like this really just, it's a pretty heavy episode to watch. And the episode kind of just concludes with her going into the morgue where Shirley is working on Nell, and she touches Nell's like face or arm, I forget, she touches Nell somewhere, and she just falls to the ground like screaming. And that's just kind of how like the whole episode kind of concludes, with you not really knowing what's happening, but she has touched Nell, who is dead, and now she's having this like really averse reaction.
Right. And another kind of like underlying thing in this episode is that she gets like a quasi girlfriend.
Oh, that's right. Mm-hmm.
And like you kind of see that Theo's the type of character who just wants to avoid kind of emotional attachments to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, her sensitivity is a part of that. Like she wears
gloves.
Long gloves usually, but yeah, she wears gloves all the time so she doesn't accidentally start feeling things that she doesn't want to feel.
Correct.
So she's very particular about that as well. And
yeah.
Overall good episode though.
It's a really good episode. It like I said, it's a really heavy episode with the whole Mr. Smiley thing. It's really tough to watch if that's like a trigger point for you. But it's very good. I think for me, Theo is one of my favorite characters.
Right.
So I really like the episode personally.
Yeah, it's a likable episode just because she is
a likable character.
Yeah, she's one of the most likable Cranes, I
Definitely.
think. Especially at the beginning.
She's one of the most put together mentally Cranes.
Right.
Which is funny because like I feel like all her siblings would argue against that. But being an outside perspective, like it's like she has the most like put together life.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Episode 4.
Episode 4. This is a very apt episode for me, actually. It's called The Twin Thing.
So if you guys don't know, if you haven't listened to our other episodes, Alex is a twin herself. And she is a fraternal twin with a boy.
Yeah, so it's very close to home for me because I'm a part of a boy-girl twin grouping as well.
Yes.
So this episode is about Luke. So it really follows him around. It kind of starts off with him actually getting his 90-day chip in rehab. So he's in a rehab facility, gets his 90-day chip. He's pretty excited about it. It introduces his friend Joey, who also lives at the rehab facility. She has been sober technically for longer than him, and it's kind of about a little bit about their relationship, their friends, and that's kind of a thing that skeeves out everyone else at the rehab facility, just because they are kind of saying like, hey, you shouldn't be depending on other addicts.
Right.
Like, it's not wise to get involved, especially since a lot of them seem to think that there's an undercurrent of like, oh, they're like a couple,
mm-hmm.
which they aren't.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that's one thing that he talks to the rehab director about, like, hey, we're not a couple, you know, we're just friends, like, why can't we be friends, like, we are the ones who understand the most what we're going through, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So, at this point, Joey's acting kind of shifty, and she ends up breaking out of rehab. And Luke, being the loyal guy that he is, jumps out a window, well, out of his window.
Jumps out a window.
Single story window, don't worry about it. But yeah, he escapes rehab to go try to find her. And this is kind of almost like parallel action to the first episode a little bit, because we realize why he steals from Steve, which I'll get to in a minute. But yeah, he, leaves to go find Joey, ends up finding her, and she's just like, they're not going to let me come back, blah, blah, blah. And Luke's like, no, like, we'll explain it together. Like, they'll let you back. Like, I'm gonna help you, Mm-hmm. And he starts feeling kind of sick. And the thing is that, like, he describes a little bit earlier, like, what it feels like to go through withdrawals. Mm-hmm. And he's told this to Steve as well. And, like, it's starting to look like he's having withdrawal symptoms, but we know that it's not withdrawal.
Yeah, because he hasn't used. Like, he's still clean.
Right.
Even though he has left the rehab center.
Right. And this is at this point, it's after his sister died. He has no idea that Nell's dead at this point. So this episode shows during different, like, flashback parts that they have a connection where if one of them is hurt, one of them is sick, that they feel it. Mm-hmm. Because even Nell had said in a flashback that, like, oh, I remember, like, when he was going through his withdrawals because I felt sick for a couple days and whatever.
Right.
And she had to explain this actually to her therapist, because that's another key thing that we forgot to mention, is that before she dies, she's seeing a therapist.
Correct.
But anyway, so going back to Luke and Joey. So Joey's just like, hey, like, do you have any money on you? We just need to stay in a hotel, and, I need to come down because, like, she's been using at this point. And he's like, oh, yeah, sure, and whatever. And, like, they end up, like, having a moment, which is kind of confusing for him. But he comes to realize it's because she's picking his pockets.
Yep. And
leaves him penniless. So he's, like, walking around LA, starting to have withdrawal symptoms, ends up getting jumped by a bunch of people. They steal his shoes, so he's looking a sight.
And his sweater, his coat.
Right. Yeah, so he's just, like, having a really hard time. He ends up in his time on the street, basically, because it doesn't really say how long he's been on the street, like maybe a day and a half or something.
Right.
And at night, after all this is happening, he starts seeing his personal demon, which is a ghost called the Bowler Man. Mm-hmm.
Bowler Hat Man.
Bowler Hat Man. So if you don't know what a bowler hat is, I suggest you Google
it. Look it up.
And he also sees his childhood friend, Abigail, which no one believes him that she exists.
At this point, we are led to believe that she is an imaginary friend.
Right.
Or a ghoul, potentially.
Right. And Steve ends up finding him on the street, and because at this point she's, he needs to look for his brother Luke, because they need to all go back to Boston, which is where Hill House is, mm-hmm. and where Shirley and Theo live, because they need to go back for the funeral. So he finds Luke. It's like, hey, Nell's dead. And Luke's really confused, especially considering, like, everything he's been feeling. So it finally dawns on him, what's going on, because Steve was just like, Nell killed herself, and Luke immediately knows that that's not true. Mm-hmm. He knows that something is afoot.
Right. And so for me, this episode is, like, really sad, because this is, like, the first episode that we really get into knowing who Luke is, because prior to this, we're just kind of told, like, he's a drug addict, he's ruined a lot of events. So we've been just kind of painted this negative light. And obviously the first episode, we see him, like, totally stealing from his brother.
Right. And he was like, oh yeah, I forgot to circle back to that. The reason why he was stealing from his brother was to help get money for Joey to, right. like, go to a hotel. Not to get drugs.
Yeah, but to, like, help her get clean.
Yeah, so Steve thinks at this point that he's going on a bender because he's having withdrawal symptoms, but it's not actually withdrawal symptoms.
Correct. So, yeah. So, like I said, like, we've been painted this picture to see, like, Luke as a villain. And then after we watch this episode, it's like, oh, no, he's really just a victim of his environment.
Right. I mean, besides the initial drug using.
But, I mean, the initial drug using is probably because of his horrors from his past.
Yeah. It's a really hard episode for me to watch, being, a part of a twin pair.
Yeah.
especially like, because we even had this conversation as we were watching it, because like one of the things that, like one of the flashbacks we were shown is that Shirley turned Luke away from Nell's wedding.
That comes later. No, it's in this episode?
Yeah, because it goes back.
I thought it was in Nell's episode. Okay.
Because it jumps around a lot. But anyway, gets turned away from this wedding, and I feel like I'd want my brother at my wedding no matter what.
Right.
But that's just me. Yeah, it's really sad. And also, little kid Luke is the most adorable thing
Oh,
ever.
yeah, 100%. He's the cutest little thing you've ever seen in your life.
And that doesn't help either, like, because he's a little boy with glasses, and when I was growing up, like, my twin brother had glasses as well,
geez,
and had,
so
like,
it's just
blondish hair as well, so I'm just
Yeah.
like, oh, it's my brother!
Hitting home, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next episode is episode 5, so at this point it's halfway through the series, and for me, this is one of the more saddest episodes that they have. This is called The Bent Neck Lady, and obviously it follows Nell. And so we see how when she's a kid, she's obviously plagued with sleep paralysis, and this is when she starts seeing this woman with a broken neck. And so as an adult, she continues to have these visions, and she eventually decides, like, I need to get help, so she goes to a sleep tech. She ends up having, like, really hitting it off at her appointment with the sleep tech, and she falls in love with him. His name is Arthur. And so at this point, it kind of shows how she's, like, really happy. They're having such great memories with each other. He proposes, and now they're going to get married. So at her wedding, I thought this is where Luke gets kicked out, but maybe it happened in the prior episode. But basically, like Alex said, Shirley kicks Luke out of the wedding. He's not allowed to come because he's also high when he shows up. So she's like, you're not about to ruin this wedding. And la la la. So before we see, like, the happy times, we kind of, like, fast forward in time once they're already married. And we see that Nell starts seeing the bent neck lady again. And she, like, mentions, like, how she hasn't seen her since she met Arthur, and how all of a sudden she's coming back again. And so he kind of, like, helps her through the process of her sleep paralysis. And on the second time that she goes through this whole, like, paralysis kind of thing, Arthur gets up to turn on the light, and he ends up having an aneurysm and dies. And so while she's paralyzed, sees the love of her life on the floor dead, she kind of looks forward and she sees, like, the silhouette of the bent neck lady. So she is just kind of, like, gung-ho on this idea that her demon, the bent neck lady, has killed her husband. So she's just kind of, like, losing it at this point. Theo ends up coming to visit her in California, and we're really seeing how Nell's mental state is really deteriorating. So she hasn't cleaned her apartment. She's totally just, like, not interested in actually, like, bonding with her sister. More of, like, she wants Theo to come and, like, touch different aspects of the apartment to see if, like, the bent neck lady actually killed her husband. It's really bad, and so we see that, like, Nell and her have this big falling out, and which is kind of, like, also explained in Theo's episode where she says that, like, she hasn't talked to Nell since California, la la la. So kind of fast forwards, and we see that Nell is now in the motel, which was, like, it was displayed in, like, the first episode, like I was saying, when Nell was calling Steve and she was calling Shirley, and she was in that dank kind of motel. So now it's, like, fast forward to her version of it, like, her perspective. And so she's in this motel that they ended up staying at when they originally ran from the house as kids, the night that, like, it all went down when, like, Liv died. So it's just, like, a lot of, like, bad juju going on at this point. She ends up going to, like, this hallway where she's buying, like, a soda from, like, the vending machine, and the lights start flickering, and then all of a sudden the bent neck lady, like, drops from the ceiling in front of her and just is, like, hanging from the ceiling. And she's, like, screaming, and she's like, what the heck? So she goes back to her motel room, and I guess at this point she's just like, okay, I'm really going crazy. I need to figure it out. Oh, sorry, let me, like, backtrack it a little bit to, like, the whole, like, she's really losing it. So prior to this, she goes to one of Steven's book readings or whatever, and she, like, crashes the whole event and starts bringing up all these things about Hill House and how he's a fraud and all these things. And so he pulls her aside, and he's just like, Nell, like, what are you doing? Like, you can't ruin, you know, my professional career just because you're going through an episode. And so at this point, he's asking her, like, are you taking your medicine? And she's like, yeah, I am. When, like, it's, like, really obvious that she's not. And so this is kind of when we start seeing that her, like, mental state is deteriorating. And plus, like, every time that she goes to see her therapist is, like, insistent that, like, the house and all the happenings and the demons are all in her head. So that's why she's at the motel in the first place, because she's like, okay, like, I'm really losing it. I'm going crazy. My therapist is telling me I need to, like, confront my fears, whatever. So after she sees the bent neck lady in the hallway, she's like, okay, I need to confront this because it's in my head and I'm crazy and whatever. So she drives to the house at night, and this is when she calls Hugh, and she's just like, Dad, the bent neck lady's back, la 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 la. And then we see in her perspective that the lights turn on. She gets out of her car and she goes into the house. When she enters the house, it's not the, like, decaying, gross, scary house that it should be. Instead, it's like this beautiful, lively house that it was back in the day when they were kids. And she starts seeing, like, her siblings when they were kids, like, running around the house and, like, telling her, like, no, like, where have you been, la la la. And then she sees her mom, and her mom's like, oh, it's about time that you got in here. And so she's like, what? So she's going through the house, because obviously these hallucinations are very intriguing.
And a key thing is when her mom sees her is like, oh, you're late for the tea party. Like, that's going to be key.
Right, you're late, right. So then she's like, oh, I'm sorry. And then so she ends up, like, going through the house, seeing all of her siblings, seeing all of her family all together again. And then at the back of, like, all of them is Arthur, her husband, who is dead.
Deceased.
Yes. And so she's, like, so, like, beyond herself happy and is dancing with him through this house. But when you see, like, real time, you know, not in her hallucination, she's obviously, like, dancing through this, like, really creepy, dark, like, decayed house. So we already know it's, like, bad stuff's gonna happen. So after all these hallucinations are going on, we eventually get up to, like, that red room that Alex is talking about that's at the top of the spiral staircase. And Liv, her mom, is, like, giving her this locket that she had been fixated on when she was a kid. And so she's, like, so happy about it. She puts it around her neck, and then all of a sudden she's like, wait, like what? And then we see, like, in real time that it's actually a noose. And then as she's talking to her mom, like, all of a sudden she realizes she's on the other side of the balcony. Like, she's no longer on, like, the safe side. She's on, like, the other side of the railing. And she's like, wait, what's going on? So she's panicking, and she's like, wait, like, this isn't right. And she's, like, trying to get over. And her mom eventually is just like, no, like, it's time to wake up. And she, like, pushes her. And so she then falls and hangs herself. And before she dies, or maybe when she dies, I don't know. As she's dying, she realizes that the whole time throughout her childhood, the bent neck lady is actually herself.
Yeah, because, like, she drops through reality.
Yeah, she drops through reality, so she sees, like, herself as kids and the different events of her life, like, when she saw the bent neck lady, and she realizes that it's herself when she's now hanged and her neck is broken. So it's been herself that has been haunting herself her whole life. So it's, like, this cyclical, like, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Which is beyond horrific.
Yeah, I feel like this is the first time in this season where, like, things get, like, really kind of spooky and crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that ending was a really good ending as far as, like, that's a pretty big shocker. Like, the way that she, like, goes through time, like, it's kind of like she keeps dropping.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And she drops into, like, different different, like, scenes from her past. So, like, the first one she drops into is when she scares herself at the motel. Like, just like the night before.
Mm-hmm.
And then keeps going until she's hovering above herself. Well, no, until the first episode, haunting.
Yeah, the first episode.
And then, because in the first episode, the bent neck lady had screamed at young Nell.
Yeah.
And that's when she, like, fully realizes what's going on, and she screams, like, in the current episode.
Right, correct.
So, spooky times.
It's one of the best episodes, I feel like, because it's just really, like you said, it's the most shocking, like, oh my gosh, like, this whole time we've been super creeped out by this bent neck lady, because arguably she is definitely the scariest ghoul.
Yeah. It's a good plot twist.
Yeah, and to realize that it's been Nell this whole time, it's just, yeah, it really gets you.
Yeah. Alright, so moving on to episode 6. It's called Two Storms. And this is really the first episode where Hugh, the dad, is kind of prominently featured. I wouldn't necessarily go to say that it's his episode, but it's the first episode that he's really together and with his family, and the whole family is together on one coast.
Right.
So, I believe actually this kind of starts with his version of the night that Nell died.
Mm-hmm.
He, wakes up at 3 a.m. because he's on the East Coast, and, she's dead and whatever. And we kind of start to see that he's kind of being haunted himself. because an arm goes around him, a female arm, and turns around and, like, no one's actually there.
Right.
So that's a little bit spooky. And this is when the family initially gets together for Nell's, I guess, kind of viewing. It's like the day before the funeral. They're all at Shirley's place. And all the kids show up first, and then Hugh shows up because they had different kind of flights, I guess. Anyway, they all show up. They're kind of like trading stories about Nell as a kid. And at this point, all the kids are the ones who were talking, and they were talking about stories that happened at their aunt's house, like after the mom died and they weren't with Hugh anymore. And that leads Hugh to really tell a beautiful story about how selfless Nell was. Like, when she would write letters to Santa Claus, it'd be all very formal, and she'd only ask for things for her siblings. It was, like, super nice moment. You know, you think that, wow, what a good guy, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, Steve has to come in with the 1-2 punch of, oh, really, you want to go there? And, like, starts kind of fighting, and this is when they all start talking about what has kind of been bothering them their entire lives, is they feel that Hugh has been holding so much back about the last night at Hill House.
Right.
So they start bickering about that, which is, you know, not great. And then you kind of see, the audience gets to see that this entire time, basically, a ghost of Liv is hanging out with Hugh. So she'll talk to him, and he'll talk to her back. But to his children, it seems like he's talking to himself.
Correct.
Which perpetuates Steve's whole idea of this family just has mental illness. Like, we're just deranged. You know, this is the reason why people in the family are killing themselves. Like, we just are mentally ill.
Right.
And, like, this starts to bring back, you know, flashbacks to the house where there's a storm one night, and the chandelier falls, which brings them all to the foyer of the house. And Nell ends up going missing after a flash of lightning. And, like, everyone's tripping out, like, trying to, like, look for her or whatever. And the parents are like, okay, Steve, you're in charge. Hang out with the kids down here. Liv and I are going to, you know, go upstairs and look around. Like, maybe she went back to her room, blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of damage happening to this house right now because of the storm. Like, there's a lot of wind, a lot of rain, a lot of thunder and lightning. And it ends up that, like, we follow Liv looking around, and then we start seeing a ghost, actually, in one of the rooms. But she hasn't seen it yet. And then we cut to Hugh, and he's looking, you know, for Liv and whatever. And she starts acting strangely. Like, you see her in a hallway, like, looking at Hugh, and then, like, he notices her, and she starts walking away, kind of down these corridors in a way that doesn't make sense. Like, he follows her down a corridor, all of a sudden she's not there, and then he backtracks, and she's in the other corridor where it doesn't make sense that she could have, like, walked there. It's, like, almost like she's transporting.
Right.
And then a bunch of windows break, blah, blah, blah. All this weird stuff happens, and he was like, what is going on here? And then Nell finally appears, and she's just like, I was screaming, you know, no one was hearing me, I was right here this whole time, why didn't you guys see me, blah, blah, blah. So there's just a lot of weird stuff happening where he was kind of just trying to take care of his family, and, you know, the home is going crazy, his wife seems to be losing it a little bit, like, what is going on here? And another thing that was kind of introduced in the twin episode is, anyway, another thing that was, so another thing that was, kind of highlighted in the twin episode is, you know, Nell's really scared of stuff as a child, and Luke is trying to help his sister out, and Nell has this collection of buttons in, like, this tin thing.
Right.
So, like, he takes out the buttons, like, puts it on her bed, like, when they're kids, and pulls out 7 and tells her, like, count, you know, each button, you know, 1 to 7 until, like, you feel better.
Right.
Like, so that's kind of a thing between them. Like, they just keep, you know, counting to 7, and that's supposed to make them feel better because 7 is the amount of people in their family.
Right.
So at this point, when it comes back from the flashback and like after, you know, they're fighting still in the funeral home, and they all turn to look at Nell, and she has buttons on her eyes.
Mm-hmm. Like kind of like Coraline style, like just buttons that look like your eyes.
Yeah, so that's not really great. Other stuff that happens during this whole thing, because during the fighting, Shirley takes a cheap shot at Steve and just like, your blood money, blah, 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 where she finds out that Theo and Shirley's husband, Kevin, have both taken money from Steve. Because Steve, when he first published a book, is just like, hey, I'll give every one of you a cut.
Yeah, like
I realize this is not all my story.
Right.
And then Shirley kind of made the unilateral decision, like, no one's going to take your money.
Mm-hmm.
But again, behind her back, both her husband Kevin and Theo have taken the money, which
Right.
is how Theo got her doctorate.
Right.
So she finds out for the first time that things aren't as she seems, and she's really ticked off about it, and just like, everyone get out. And at this point, Kevin and Theo like go off because Theo's been told, like, vacate this house, like, you're no longer able to live here, because she lives with Shirley in like a
guest house.
Yeah, guest house. And so Kevin goes to help her find more alcohol because at this point she's also drunk.
No, it was because of the blackout, and they went to look for like light source or the generator or something. He went to help her find more booze.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
All right.
Anyway, so after all the blackout and whatever, because the blackout does happen after the whole button thing, and like everyone's trying to, you know, find out like what's going on and whatever, and then Luke ends up understanding kind of what's going on here, like that this is the house doing stuff, and he like talks to his dad. He's like, hey, like, is this what I think it is, blah blah blah. And he's like, yeah man, it is. Also, when Shirley goes down to look into the generator, she ends up finding Kevin and Theo seeming to be in an embrace, seeming to almost being kissing.
In a compromising position.
Yeah, compromising position, which doesn't do them any favors because Shirley's already mad at them.
Right.
So there's that. And then also, amidst different arguing and whatever, because after Luke kind of confirms with his dad, like, hey, like, something's going on and it's the house's fault, Steve is just like, don't you do this again. Luke is, you know, an impressionable person. This is the reason why he's so messed up, blah, blah, blah. And to just, like, cherry on top of this whole unpleasant situation, Nell's casket falls.
Right.
Like, the stand that's holding it up breaks.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, it's great.
Yeah, so, like, that episode is, it's a interesting episode, I feel like, because it's, like, really high energy, a lot of, like, arguing, a lot of, like, bad emotions towards each other as family members, so it's a little bit difficult to watch in that sense. But it's really crucial to push forward the storyline as to, like, what's happening now that Nell is dead and everyone, like, knows about it.
And this is, like, the beginning of things actually starting to get spooky.
Yeah, this is definitely, like, the pinnacle of, like, okay, now we're going to see what Hill House is going to do to everyone as an adult.
Yep.
Okay, so episode 7, this is called Eulogy. We start with the flashback when Hugh realizes that there's a mold problem in the house. So he's starting to find a lot of, like, affected areas where, like, the walls are decaying. So him and Mr. Dudley, the groundskeeper, they go around marking all the walls that need to be cleansed, you know, if that's the right word for it. And in the process of doing this, Hugh ends up hearing, like, this, like, scratching noise behind the wall. And so he's thinking, great, on top of having to deal with the mold, now I have to deal with a rat problem. So during the whole mold thing, he gets Steve to help him out, and one thing leads to another. Hugh's not paying attention, and he ends up, like, severing his whole thumb off, basically, like, through this, like, blade thing that they have. So he's just like, gosh, Jesus. So, like, now he's injured. He's trying to take care of the mold. He's hearing this rat problem. Not good. So now he's just like, okay, let's get the rats out of the wall. So he ends up taking, like, a brick or something, or making a hole in the wall and taking a Polaroid picture of behind the wall to try to see, like, the rats or something. And when the Polaroid starts developing, they're like, wait a second, that's not a rat. And when they break down the whole wall, they find like a skeleton of a person who has cemented themselves behind the wall. Like they cemented themselves in. And so it's just like, whoa, like this is unsettling, what's going on. And then from Luke's episode, we remember that, or no, not Luke's, actually, it was Theo's episode when Luke went down in the dumbwaiter. We remember that this is the same man that, like, or the same creature that came crawling at him when he was in the dumbwaiter and trying to, like, attack him. So we're just like, ooh, what is going on? So then throughout this episode, Liv starts continuing to demonstrate some odd behaviors, as Alex said in the prior episode. She was kind of just like quasi like transporting her body from place to place. She didn't really know what was going on. And in this episode, she has like this dream, and when she wakes up, she's holding a screwdriver to Hugh's throat. And he's just like, what gives, you know? So that's like the first time that we're just like, wait, what's happening? And she's like, oh, I don't know what's happening. I don't know how to explain this, la la la. And then it goes on further. So when he was trying to take care of the whole mold problem and realize like which walls need to be repaired, which walls need to be rebuilt, whatever, she gives him the blueprints that she's been working on of the house, and he looks at it and he's just like, what the heck? And he ends up showing it to Mr. Dudley, and we at this point don't know what is on the blueprints, but based off of their reaction, we come to realize that it's not good. And so Mr. Dudley really recommends that he gets Liv to leave the house for some time. And so he's saying how when his mother used to work in the house, she would have also these episodes of kind of like losing it until she would spend time away from the house, and then she would kind of like get back on her feet. So this is like when we're starting to really see that Liv is, you know, she's kind of in La La Land or something. So then we go back or forward in time to present day, and the family keeps getting mad that Hugh is not saying the right things at the funeral, and everyone's just kind of getting against him. And then Luke like says like a jab, you know, just like, oh, like big boys know how to tell what's real and what's fake. So like everyone's just kind of turning against Hugh. And at the end of this episode, Luke ends up taking off with Shirley's credit card.
Right. And it kind of shows at the end of that episode that he has an intent to mess up that house.
Yes.
Like, he's just not, like, splitting, you know,
well,
for
I feel like at the end of this episode, like, it's kind of clear to the audience that his intent is maybe to do something to, like, gain, what's the word? Like, avenge Nell's death.
Right.
But to the family, they're thinking, like, great, he's about to go, like, blow it on drugs, you know?
Absolutely. 100%. And, you know, it's a good build-up episode to the next one, which is called Witness Marks.
Mm-hmm.
So this episode takes place on Halloween. Mm-hmm. And at this point, it opens with Shirley. She's at her house. Kevin's not there because she kicked him out. And, you know, she's having several moments because obviously she's had enough of her family right now. She's pretty ticked off and blah, blah, blah. And obviously her credit card's been stolen. So she starts experiencing weird things when someone keeps knocking on her front door, but no one's there every time that she opens it. So she thinks at first that it's trick-or-treaters, but it's not really at all. This is when she starts getting haunted, but she doesn't really realize it. And this episode we find out about a man that she's kind of been seeing, her personal demon, as it were. He's not actually a ghost, though. He's the hallucination of a guy that she met at a bar. So it kind of gets into the coroner's convention that she went to a couple years before the events of this episode, where she runs into another mortician. They end up flirting. They're both married. They both know it. And then they end up having an affair. Just like, you know, brief one-night stand thing. So this is like the guilt that she's been carrying around with her and hallucinating about since the beginning of the series. Mm-hmm. And also, as events happen through this episode, in the end of the previous episode, Q and Steve decide to go after Luke, you know, to try to get the credit card back, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
They end up realizing, oh, Luke is going to the back to Hill House because they find out that the credit card purchase that Luke had made was at a gas station. Found out that he's purchased gasoline in a gas can. Like, oh, he's gonna burn down the house. So they call.
Well, he's purchased 5 gas cans of gasoline.
Right. And so they call Shirley and Theo, just like, hey, you need to come to the house, to Hill House. This is what Luke is doing, blah, blah, blah. So Luke and Theo set out to go figure this whole thing out. Theo tries to explain what happens with Kevin. So her whole thing, you know, Shirley is kind of super skeptic about all the stuff that's been going on throughout their entire lives and probably doesn't really empathize a lot with Theo's sensitivity.
Yeah.
And Theo tries to explain about what she felt when she touched Nell's dead body, which essentially is nothing. And she couldn't shake the feeling of nothingness that she felt since touching her sister. And so, in the time, she wasn't trying to, you know, come on to Kevin per se. She just wanted to feel something again.
And she was also drunk.
And she was drunk. 100%. And Shirley's not really about hearing it, though. So, you know, that's great. And during this episode as well, we find out why Steve is no longer living at home. It's because his wife wanted to have children. And Steve's whole thing is, my family has mental illness. I don't want to have children, but I'm not going to talk to you about it. So I'm going to just go off and get a vasectomy.
Yeah.
So his wife ends up finding out, and that's why they're separated. And he ends up being forced to admit this to his wife, Lee. Well, about his wife. Yeah, he's forced to admit to his dad about his wife, Lee.
Correct.
And, so we end up realizing throughout this whole situation, which kind of leads back to the title of this episode, while he's admitting to his dad about all this stuff, like, he talks about different workers that Steve saw in the house, like, when they spent that summer there, like, oh, this guy's working on that clock, and Hugh starts talking about what witness marks are, which are marks on a clock, actually, fun fact, which show that that clock has had maintenance done on it, whatever. And then Hugh was just like, no, you didn't see those workers. We didn't hire anyone for that clock. What you saw were ghosts. So Steve is kind of, like, starting to, like, at least hear and realize, like, oh, things weren't as what you thought that they were at that house. And we get to jump back to Shirley and Theo. They're driving and fighting and have a really fun jump scare that did a number on me and Drea when we watched it for the first time.
It was definitely the only jump scare that really got us when we first watched this.
So, I have to ask, because I don't remember and we haven't gotten up to this episode yet, like, as we've been rewatching, is it Liv or is it Nell?
I think we go back and forth on what we think it is. I think we determined that it's Liv.
Yeah. Anyways, jumps from the backseat of the car and, like, screams, like, at the both of them. They hop out of the car. Theo has a breakdown, and that's when she, you know, talks about the feeling nothingness thing. And Shirley's just ignoring what just happened, just like, hey, we need to get back in the car and drive, which I think is the craziest thing ever.
Yeah, totally.
And then the episode ends up ending with Luke at the house, pouring gasoline everywhere, and he lights a fire, but it gets extinguished right away.
Like, out of nowhere, like, the house extinguishes it.
Yeah. And then he sees his mom, and she's like, hey, come with me.
Right. And so now Luke is in the house, as Nell once was.
Right. So things aren't looking so good for our boy, Luke.
Right. Which brings us into episode 9, Screaming Mimes is the title of this episode. And so this episode is basically about Liv, and it just really shows how her mental state just plummeted. So the episode starts with her, like, laying on this couch, and she's holding the twins, and she's saying how, like, oh, she never wants this moment to end, she never wants them to grow up, and she's, like, holding them, and then, like, all of a sudden, Hugh is just like, okay, like, you gonna come with us? And she realizes that she's not holding them, and she was, like, imagining it, and it's just like, oh, like, that was odd. So that was, like, the first, like, oh, she's kind of losing her mind a little bit. But then she like starts talking about how when she experienced her father passing, she had this inability to cry. And it wasn't until there was this like huge storm that happened and she felt like rocks were hitting the ceiling that she finally was able to cry. And it was like this interesting kind of like connection to her past and what was going on in her current. And it's just like kind of weird to see like, okay, so we're starting to see like, okay, so like Liv, it's not necessarily like this is happening to Liv out of the blue. She's kind of like had to deal with this weird mental state her whole life, and it's just now being exacerbated, probably because of the house and the energies that are in it. And she starts getting these headaches in her reading room. And the reading room in particular is an important note. We'll touch on it in the last episode. But she's like getting these headaches or her color storms. She's starting to not understand what is a dream and what is reality. And she starts seeing Poppy, who is a ghost, which I don't know if she realizes is a ghost, but she used to live in Hill House before she died, obviously. And Poppy starts like suggesting these things to Liv and telling her that like her kids and her are not actually awake and that she needs to wake up her kids in order to save them.
Save them from the world.
Save them from the world. And Liv at this point is, like I said, she's kind of losing her mind. She's very suggestible. And then there's this whole scene where she's putting the twins to bed, and each twin sits up, and they're just like, Mommy, like, what if this happens? And, like, Nell starts, like, saying, like, what if, like, I start having these bad dreams, and, like, the dreams, like, drive me crazy, and I'm starting to, like, lose it, and eventually, like, it drives me so crazy that I kill myself. And then, like, Luke is just like, yeah, Mommy, what if, like, all of the things that are happening in this house, like, make me so sick that I want to fill my body with poison, and I'm injecting poison into my body until it becomes too much, and, like, eventually, like, my organs bleed out, and this is this. And she's just, like, listening to these kids tell her these things, and she's like, well, that'll never happen. I'll never allow that to happen to you. And then like, Hugh comes in the door, and he's like, what are you doing? And then she realizes, like, the whole time she was talking to nobody, and it's not even nighttime, it's, like, daytime, and Nell and Luke are not in the room. And so it's just like, Liv is crazy. And the scene alludes, obviously, to what actually happens to the two twins, because obviously Nell did lose her mind over her dreams and the bent neck lady, and, like, eventually did die. And then Luke is injecting himself with quote-unquote poison because he's a drug addict. And then this also, in this episode, we see when Steve gives Liv a vanity that he found in, like, one of the rooms. He, like, refurbishes it and gives it to her as a gift, and she's like, oh my God, thank you. And then she's looking in the mirror, and we see that in the mirror she sees the reflection of adult Luke and Nell. And she punches the mirror, and she's like, oh, like, I'm so sorry, you know. And it's just like, what is happening to you, woman? So yeah, so, like, it's all bad news. She's really losing her mind. And we also find out that the Dudleys have a daughter. And so Claire tells Liv, Claire is Mrs. Dudley, and she's, like, telling Liv, like, yeah, my daughter this, my daughter that, whatever. And then after Liv is telling her, like, I just feel so concerned for the kids, Claire is ultimately like, you know, I think you should take time away from the house. It really isn't, like, great to stay here all this time. And so ultimately she's like, you know what, I think you're right. Maybe I should take time away. And so the family sees Liv off, and Luke asks her right before she leaves, hey, can my friend Abigail sleep over? And at this point, obviously, they think that Abigail is an imaginary friend. So the mom's like, of course, whatever, it's fine. She leaves, but we see that she actually goes to that motel that's down the street, and she didn't actually go to see her sister, which she said she was going to do. And she calls the house, and she's like, hey, like, how are the kids, whatever? And she's like, I'm about to see my sister, when she's obviously not. So she ultimately comes back to the house at night, and she goes to see the twins, first she goes to the kitchen, and she's making tea, and Shirley comes in, and she's like, Mom, like, I thought you left. And the mom's like, well, I just missed you guys so much, I came back. And so she goes upstairs to the twins' room, and she gets both Nell and Luke, and at this point she realizes that there's another girl in the room, and this is supposedly Abigail, and they're just like, Mom, like, what are you doing home? And she's like, oh, like, I came home to have a tea party. So she takes all three kids up to the red room, and they're having this tea party in the red room. And so Shirley goes to Hugh's bedroom and wakes him up, and she's like, hey, Dad, like, by the way, Mom's home. Like, I didn't know she was going to come home. And he was like, wait a second, like, what? She's not supposed to be here. So he goes to the kitchen where Shirley said she saw her, and he sees that next to the tea setup, there's a can of rat poison. And he's like, what the heck? So he's looking everywhere for them. He goes in the room, he doesn't see them, and he sees the light up in the bedroom. And so he runs up there, and he sees that she's trying to give them this tea, and he immediately, like, slaps the tea out of Luke and Nell's hand. But at this point, Abigail has drank the tea. And so she is now foaming at the mouth. Like, she just ingested rat poison, so she is a goner, obviously. So at this point, he was like, what the heck? So he grabs all the kids, and this takes us back to that first episode when he's getting all the kids, putting them in the car, and they're trying to flee the house and go to that motel. And so he gets all the kids, he leaves, and lives in the house like, what gives? And she's like, okay, like, Poppy, like, I don't want to do this. Like, I'm ready to wake up. Like, this is my nightmare. I'm ready to wake up. Which Poppy then pushes her off of the banister, and that's how Liv dies.
In the same place that Nell died.
That Nell dies, correct.
So, that's a lot for that episode.
It is a very heavy episode. Definitely.
Which leads us to
the final.
The final episode. It's called Silence Lay Steadily. So, this begins with our first inkling that all the kids had been inside the red room before. So it starts off with this, like, dual action thing kind of going on, where Theo is in her quote-unquote dance studio, a place where she's been, like, watching MTV videos or whatever and dancing. And it also shows a flashback to a scene that we've seen before of Shirley and Nell trying to get into the red room and, like, trying to open it with the skeleton key and, like, jiggling the handle. And we see that Theo's actually on the other side. So that's kind of like a hint of stuff to come. So after that, it opens with Steve and Hugh finally getting to Hill House and walking in for the first time. And Steve starts actually noticing the ghosts around there. Mm-hmm. He sees the bowler hat man. Like, he was like, hey, come on, let's go. Hugh is like, come on, let's go. They go over towards the library area. And Hugh tries to be the best dad ever, when the bowler hat man, like, tries to look Steve in the face. Like, Hugh just like, hey, look at me. Don't look over there. Look at me.
Yeah.
Which is like, poor Hugh, man.
It's heartbreaking to see how he has been villainized by the family.
He's really just trying to protect his family.
Right.
And that's, like, shown there as well.
Right.
So, at this point, like, they go up to the red room, trying to open the door, can't. And then he was, like, looking around for, some way to, like, open it. The door opens, unbeknownst to Hugh, and then Steve looks and sees Luke in there, so he rushes in, and Luke's on the floor and whatever. And, that's when all the kids start having hallucinations. So Steve hallucinates that he's back with Lee, they never separated, and that she's pregnant. And then that kind of gets flipped on its head in a scary way. Luke has a hallucination that, Joey didn't rip him off. Like, they did go to that, like, hotel together and, like, everything's okay. That gets flipped on its head as well. Shirley has the hallucination that she said no to the bar guy, and the bar guy, like, gets all crazy with her. And then Theo has the hallucination about, about her girlfriend, kind of. Mm-hmm. Her not so girlfriend at this time, girlfriend. Mm-hmm. And they all wake up inside the red room. Theo's the last one to wake up and realizes that Shirley's doing chest compressions on Luke, because Luke has, it seems, shot up rat poison. Right. So he's dying. Luke crosses over and, like, appears in this room where he's an adult. It's in the red room, but it's all painted white. He sees Abigail there. He sees his mother, and he sees child Nell. Right. And the mom's just like, hey, like, I'm glad you're here. We've been waiting for you. And she's wearing the bowler hat and whatever.
Creepy.
And Nell's like, no, dude, you gotta go home. So then he finally wakes up, and he's alive again. And then all the siblings, like, realize they're in the room, and they're like, how do we get out? And then Ghost Nell appears. And she really has a great speech that I won't, like, ruin too much. I just tell you, go watch it, because it's a really great thing.
Nell in the last episode is just prime.
Yeah. So basically, it's kind of an opportunity for all the siblings to reconcile with each other, and especially with Nell because she's, dead.
Definitely.
And then Nell kind of has a call to action at the end of her whole speech. It's just like, hey, just like love each other. Like, I loved you completely and you love me the same.
Right.
And I'm never going to be gone even though I'm dead, sort of deal. Really beautiful moment. On the outside while this is all happening, Hugh runs into actual ghost Liv because the Liv that he's been hallucinating this whole time is kind of something he's made up in his own mind.
Right.
Whereas the Liv that he runs into in the house is the real ghost Liv. And she's in the state that she was when she died, so that means that she's crazy.
Right.
So he tries to reason with her, because she's just like, oh, the kids are here, like, we need to wake them up. And they have an argument because Liv's just like, hey, you took them from me, and you let the world hurt them. And Hugh's just like, no, you don't understand, like, this place is killing them. It's killing our children. The world isn't such a bad place, it's not all pain.
Right.
So it ends with the kids being released from the Red Room, which is great. And, like, they all, start running out of the house. Hugh helps Steve carry Luke out. And they kind of, like, stumble, and Luke looks over to the side, sees something, but he's shocked by it, but they're just like, I need to get out.
Right.
So they make it outside, and Steve starts talking to Hugh, and they end up starting reconciliation where Steve realizes that Hugh is dead because Hugh's just like, I'm not going with you, I can't go with you, sort of deal. And then Hugh shows Steve what really happened when he went back for Liv that night, the final night at Hill House, which is finding Liv's dead body and finding, Abigail's dead body and seeing them both come back alive as ghosts. And which makes them realize that anyone who dies at Hill House becomes a ghost and lives there.
Right.
So Hugh ends up making a deal with Mr. Dudley, the groundskeeper, and just like, hey, like, I'll keep this house standing so you guys can see Abigail still, but no one is allowed in here.
Right,
Like, I want this place
guys.
to, only you guys can come in here, like, this place needs to rot.
Yeah.
For what it's done. And then it reveals in that flashback, because, like, they go back inside the house, and it reveals that Hugh, in order to appease Liv, has killed himself by taking an overdose of heart medicine. And that's the only way that Liv was going to let all the kids go. So he gives this really beautiful speech at the end about, how he loves them so much, and, he's the kids are the thing that he's most proud of, and to be kind to each other, and blah, blah, blah. So that leaves Steve to, leave his father. His father turns young again, walks into the Red Room where Liv and Nell are waiting for him, and, like, they hug and whatever. And there's this really creepy moment where, like, Liv is looking over Hugh's shoulder and just, like, staring intently at Steve, and the door to the Red Room closes. So Steve turns around, he starts walking out of the house, and he's looking around, and he's seeing all the ghosts coming out, like, kind of following him. And he just, like, leaves. And then it does this flash forward of basically the happy endings everyone has, because they kind of, like, all reconciled and healed as a family. So Steve and Lee are back together. They reconcile. Shirley and Kevin reconcile in their own way. Like, it shows her admitting to Kevin, like, I cheated, but, like, in the lead up, she's like, hey, I love you, and I need you to really love me hard right now because, all this stuff happened, but, like, we are going to be okay, blah, blah, blah. Theo moves out of Shirley's guest house, throws her gloves away, which kind of shows that she's open now to emotion, just in general.
And she's also with her girlfriend at this point.
Yeah, also with her girlfriend. It kind of seems like they're moving in together. We see an aged Mr. Dudley carrying his wife, who's dying, back to Hill House.
That one gets me. Like, that one makes me want to sob.
Because Mrs. Dudley wants to die in Hill House so she can be with Abigail. And actually their first baby, because, like, they had a baby before Abigail, but it died in Hill House.
Yeah.
So you see her again now, like, after she dies, she appears as a ghost, as her young self, has Abigail, and is holding their baby.
Right.
Which is, sad and sweet.
Yeah.
And then it all ends with the family getting together to celebrate Luke's 2-year sober anniversary.
Yeah. And that's basically how it closes out.
Yeah.
Which is, I feel like it's
It's a little weird after everything that's happened, but I mean, great that all of them are good.
It's like really bittersweet because we see like the sacrifices that were needed to be made by Hugh, by Nell, in order for the rest of the family to like prosper. So it's like difficult to be happy for them because it's like, you know what I mean? Like such prominent parts of the family had to give up everything for that.
Right. And I guess like that gets us into like this argument that me and Drea have a lot when we talk about the show is who's the biggest victim? Is it Nell or is it Hugh?
Yeah. Which I advocate for Hugh because he was privy to it all longer and had to sustain this illusion to like keep the mom from looking like a demon to his kids, you know?
Right. And that's actually one thing that like Ghost Hugh does for Steve. Like at the very end, he's just like, "Hey, like this is your charge now. Like you need to, you know,
take care of the family.
Take care of the family and to keep this place."
Right.
Because you know all of these ghosts are living there, and
so we really see like the weight that is on Hugh's shoulders. That's why I advocate for Hugh. But obviously Nell is just a victim from the start. Like she's just a pure soul who was just done bad, you know, done wrong in every which way.
Yeah, she didn't deserve any of that. Neither did Hugh, but just, like, you feel especially bad because Nell was a kid when it all started.
Yeah, definitely.
So, like, it's a greater tragedy sometimes in my mind that, you know, she really had no hope in that sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's to each their own. They're both victims, definitely. Like, they're both just, like, hurt in the worst kind of ways.
And, you know, basically the best characters of the show.
Definitely, 100%.
Got the raw steel.
Yeah. So, yeah, so that's basically a recap of all the episodes of Hill House. If you guys did watch it and you agree with us, cool. If you didn't, at least this is like a summary that you could just listen to and then go straight into the second season without having to watch the first.
Sorry for any factual errors we may have.
Yeah, I mean, this is all just basically from memory, so it is what it is. But October 9th, Netflix. Gear up, you guys, because Bly Manor is supposed to be more scary than Hill House.
And it's kind of cool because it does the American Horror Story thing where, like, it uses a lot of the same actors from the previous season.
But it's a different storyline entirely.
Yeah, different storyline, different characters, but using a lot of the actors that we know and love from the first season.
Correct. So we will see Nell and Luke, Theo, and who else?
Young Hugh.
Young Hugh. We will see those four characters in the next... Oh, I think we also see Lee.
We might.
I think
We'll
Lee is
see.
also in it.
Be a good surprise.
Which is really interesting because she's such a minor character in the first season. But yeah, so we're expect to see those characters.
Those actors.
Those actors, excuse me. And also expect it to be much more creepy, apparently. And it should be fun.
Yeah.
All right, guys. So we will see you next week with another episode of TRUUU Podcast. See you later.